This evening we have Matt Kingdom and Dr. Hannah Thompson-Radford, who are talking about Unforgotten Voices, exploring the history of women's cricket in Somerset. So over to you both.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for having us. So yeah, the title in the brackets is obviously on purpose, Forgotten Voices. Basically what we're looking at here is trying to kind of recognise former players and ensuring that there isn't this feeling of forgottenness. So my background, I'm at Swansea University as an academic in media and communications and sports journalism. Recently completed my PhD exploring elite female cricketers' uses and perceptions of social kind of mediated in/visibility in ordinary and extraordinary times. And part of that research included former player voices. And one of the kind of key findings in terms of looking at media change over time was this feeling of forgottenness and this like lack of recognition for players who played in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Even to be fair, some of the players in the early 2000s and 2010s still felt relatively kind of forgotten by the media, and by the sport. So yeah, we're trying to ensure that these players are not forgotten, and for us, we're looking specifically in Somerset. So that's where I'm from originally, and this is definitely a passion project more than it is an academic project. So I will move on to the introduction, and I will allow Matt to introduce himself too.
Yeah, so I'm Matt. I guess this kind of started for me mainly from some of the work I did with the Somerset Cricket Museum back in 2023, and then subsequently to that, Hannah got in touch with me basically, and we've kind of expanded from there, just looking into the history of Somerset. You know, I've been a Somerset men's fan since 2010, and then slowly kind of got into the women's game as it's developed in time, and I really am passionate about exploring that women's history. You know, this is just something I kind of do in my free time. You know, I work for the NHS. This isn't my day job, but yeah, it's been really fascinating working with Hannah on some of the things, and hopefully, yeah, present to you tonight what some of our findings have been.
Yeah, and like I said, this isn't an academic project for me, although I am thinking perhaps this maybe needs to be turned into a more of an academic project too, but it's certainly been kind of like from a place of passion. I played county kind of pathways and the odd few Somerset women matches myself growing up, so I've got that affinity to the club, the area, the county as a whole. But part of the PhD, that kind of hearing the former players talk about this feeling of forgottenness, it hasn't budged, and it's really kind of sparked that passion in me, because we're seeing increasingly more coverage around the kind of the professional game now, which is brilliant. And I feel like my contribution isn't doing kind of match reports or features on the kind of current era anymore. I feel like I can really contribute to uncovering these stories of players of the past, because I feel like there is a real gap, and we're really encouraging others to hopefully do the same. Because I appreciate both Philippa and Raf as kind of chairs of this kind of network and everything. This is your area of kind of like academic research, and you are kind of like the trailblazers within that kind of space, and you've done so much important work, but there's still a huge kind of gap in terms of understanding kind of local histories, because quite a lot of the literature from an academic perspective does focus on kind of the history of England women, or thinking more on a national level than necessarily these local intricacies. So that's part of the motivation for doing this. And then the second bit is, you can see in terms of the image here, thinking about Somerset in this new era. So when they kind of put out, in terms of Somerset County Cricket Club, put out their bid for a professional women's cricket team, and there was this kind of claiming of some of the history, which you can kind of debate rightfully or wrongfully. Do they get credit for kind of the players that they mentioned within their press release? That's a whole kind of debate for another day, perhaps. But it kind of sparked that need of, okay, they're starting to take notice, they're starting to take more interest when historically clubs haven't necessarily reflected that. So let's actually try to piece together and provide context for the fans, for new fans, for existing fans. Where have Somerset women been before they become this professional team? So really important, hopefully, work just to contextualise. So thinking about the methods about our research to date, so we've got over 1,000 newspaper stories to explore. So we've done a Nexus database search using keywords, the player's name. In terms of, Matt has done a phenomenal job looking through multiple archives, which he'll discuss shortly, but I've used kind of the players that we've got. So we've got over 100 names of players who have played for Somerset, put their name in, and cricket to see what comes up. And of course, some irrelevant stuff comes up, but overwhelmingly there's been a lot of stuff that we have been able to use, but we're still processing that data. We've done 8 interviews with players more pending from the kind of 2000 era onwards. So when we're talking about history here, we are talking about kind of more recent times, as well as Matt will discuss shortly about kind of cricket in the 1950s as well. And we are looking prior to that too. But yeah, we are trying to get more interviews. So I'll hand over to Matt now to talk about the archival work that he's been doing.
Yeah, so while Hannah's been busy kind of out and about getting interviews, I've been kind of doing a bit more of the behind the scenes work online, trying to find as much as possible on the internet. There isn't loads, unfortunately, and that's kind of part of the problem that we're trying to address. But obviously the WCA records from the early 1900s onwards have been really helpful. Publications like the Women's Cricket magazine, the WCA annual minutes, that kind of thing. That's where we've gleaned a lot of information about Somerset cricket in the 1950s onwards. And then for more recent times, we have the use of Cricket Archive, which is very, very, very minimal on earlier times, but it's good for statistics, scorecards, that kind of thing for more recent times, alongside Play Cricket, which is the kind of more official ECB source for more recent women's county cricket. And another thing that I've done is reached out to 5 school and universities in the local area that have provided a bit more context for schools cricket back in the early 1900s. So places like Bath Royal School, or what we used to be called Bath Royal School, they've been really helpful with providing magazines and publications from their history, which we've used as well. So yeah, kind of a range of sources, scraping out as much as we can from the limited resources that are on the internet. Want to carry on to the next slide, Hannah? Yeah. So just to kind of give you an overview of the kind of history that we found so far. So Somerset women started off in 1953. They're formed on the 9th of May with trials at St. Catherine's School, Taunton. So the WCA publications described that 3 clubs were lured into affiliating to the WCA. So at the time, the process was that 3 clubs had to affiliate to the WCA in a county for their county to then become official and therefore start playing themselves. So the use of the word lured is quite interesting. There were sporadic periods where one club might pop up in Somerset, then another club, one might die away. So eventually in 1953, they managed to get 3 clubs all in the same place at the same time. Somerset were actually a relative latecomer, so 13 of the 17 at the time professional men's teams had already affiliated before Somerset. So Somerset finally got there in 1953, and they played their first match about a month later against Gloucestershire, and in that West Country derby they won by 5 wickets. So overall, and in their history, we've managed to find 42 recorded matches. They won 14 of them, lost 18, and drew 10. So if you rank all the counties by win percentage, that puts them about halfway on average. But they are often playing teams only in the southwest region. So they're playing Gloucestershire, Glamorgan, Devon, those kind of teams. So when they put themselves up against teams in other regions, so they played against Surrey second 11 and Middlesex second 11 a couple of times, they often lost quite heavily. So you can see the kind of disparity in the regions. Even though they're playing second 11s from other regions, they are still coming up quite short. So that's kind of gives you a bit of an idea of where Somerset were at in this initial period. So we have 69 player names gleaned from the Women's Cricket magazine and Cricket Archive, but unfortunately we only have 8 first names of players. So basically we only really have first initials and last names for a lot of these players. So there must be so many missing stories out there from players that we haven't been able to find any more information about. We have a player called Jay Britton, who we know took 4 5-wicket hauls, including 8 for 15 in one match, but we don't know any more about her, and it's very difficult to be able to find out any more about her. So it's that kind of story that we're missing from this initial period. But just to highlight a couple of players that we do have some information about, so we have Audrey Disbury, who is Somerset's only England cricketer in this period. She came over from her native Kent because of her work with the military, based at the Wrens base in Yeovilton. So she played a couple of years for Somerset, kind of adding a bit more quality to the team. And also another story to highlight is Sylvia Luscombe, who played for Somerset in 1953 only. apparently after a 20-year gap from her school days, coming back on to put on the pads and play cricket in that first year, and then afterwards becoming a really key administrator behind the scenes. And from a bit of her story that's preserved in women's cricket, we can find out this, how much she was juggling at that time. She was interested in cricket, hockey, and lacrosse. She had a family. She was president of a women's institute. She was involved in local theatre productions. So it's that kind of passion for the game that really kept it going in the amateur period. People juggling all these things, but also really desperately wanting to help their local cricket club to grow. But unfortunately, it did all come to an end for Somerset in 1967. There was a general decline in the participation in women's cricket around that time. Lots of other teams were also failing to affiliate to the WCA, and Somerset unfortunately fell by the wayside in 1967. And we have a story from Nikki Trant, who was one of the players in that era. She turned up to a ground expecting to be playing cricket, and basically found out when she got there, no one else was there, and Somerset basically no longer existed. So unfortunately, that was the end of Somerset in this initial period. Next slide, Hannah. But that wasn't the end of women's cricket in the region. So basically, Somerset were effectively replaced by a team called the West. But to kind of zoom out a bit, it's actually more difficult than it seems trying to untangle the history of the West, because there were so many teams. There's 7 listed on this slide, all with various different names of the West. So in the initial period when Somerset were playing, there was a team that I've dubbed the West District. So this was kind of a best of the best team that was taking players from Somerset, from Devon, from Gloucestershire, etc., and playing 1 or 2 games a year, and representing a region all the way from Cornwall up to Herefordshire in the north, to Hampshire in the east, and all of Wales, kind of taken into that region. But then from 1969 onwards, that former district area then became an area association in itself. So therefore, that became a domestic team in its own right, playing a lot more frequently. And moving on from there to compete in the area championship from 1980 onwards. However, there was also still a best of the best team in this period, again, also called West, which definitely doesn't get confusing at all. So that was players from the West area, from the West Midlands and the East Midlands, all combined all together. I think this is best summed up by a time in June 1976 when Australia were touring, and they played 2 games, both against the West, within a couple of days of each other. This was actually against 2 different teams, as you can see from the players that were playing in the match. One was against some West Midlands and East Midlands players, and one was against the West area team. So you can kind of see from that both the difficulty of trying to untangle the history of this period, but also kind of how the WCA was run in this time. Trying to find teams that represented adequate geographical regions that had players available, kind of worked as a geographical unit, worked as an administrative unit, but also just coming up with teams often on an ad hoc basis. Some of these other teams mentioned on this slide, West and West Midlands existed for just 2 days just to play against a couple matches against a touring team. So the kind of this idea of what made sense administratively, but also what made sense kind of on the ground for these games taking place. And kind of just as a coda on this slide, obviously we've got Western Storm there, which is a team from a very different era, obviously kind of partially from the professional era, but the Western Storm region very much does line up with the West area region, with a few counties taken off. But Western Storm again representing a very large area, from Cornwall all the way up to North Wales technically. So kind of it's history repeating itself in some ways, with the West area actually feeding into Western Storm, whether directly or indirectly. But it does show how, even though we're focusing on the history of Somerset, we do actually have to broaden our gaze a little bit to encompass the whole region, even if we're technically starting off with a narrow focus on the county. We have to untangle all of these many different teams under the name of West. Next slide, Hannah. Yeah, so but Somerset did eventually make a return. So when the WCA and the ECB merged, the thought was basically they wanted to return to the county system, and Somerset were the team that managed to, at the forefront, replace West. From 2000 to present, not to present quite, competed in the county championship. So they were a bit of a yo-yo team through this period. They're promoted 5 times and relegated 5 times in 20 county championship seasons, often kind of coming up against these promotion and relegation playoffs, often getting quite unlucky with the rain, meaning that they were relegated or failed to get promotion. So again, we've had both reorganisations on the national level, kind of changing the vibe for Somerset, but also reorganisations on the county championship level, really changing each time, often from season to season, changing the context of Somerset's cricket. But yeah, it's just interesting to reflect at this point how the Premier team in the area has changed. So we've had Somerset in the 1950s, to West from the 60s through to the 90s, back to Somerset from the 2000s onwards, then Western Storm taking over from 2016, and then professionally from 2020, and then back to Somerset for this season onwards. So, we've had that fluctuation between county to region to county to region to back to county again, because of the change in participation numbers, because of the change of fan interest. There's also that effect on the ground, which Hannah's going to talk about in a bit, about how that's effective for the players and for the catchment areas, for developing cricketers, that kind of thing. So even if it might make sense kind of on a macro level, it does have that impact on the micro level. But I guess the final reflection we wanted to talk about was what the legacy of the Somerset amateur team is, and how that reflects on Somerset's county cricket club as a whole. So Somerset CCC are celebrating their 150th anniversary this year, and one of the key prominent people in their literature and promotion of this event has been Anya Shrubsole. You can see the picture on the slide there of her being inducted into the Somerset Hall of Fame, for example. However, there's no other real mention of Somerset women's history. So Somerset are trying to claim that history of Anya Shrubsole, but not really acknowledging much of the other history, which obviously hasn't really been uncovered, and that's what some of the things we're trying to do. There is still that acknowledgement of any other history. But also there's a question of whether Somerset should get to claim Anya Shrubsole. How much role did they have in producing her as a player? And also the negative impact of that legacy. There are stories of Somerset barely even providing kit to their players, not providing travel expenses, female cricketers feeling like second-class citizens in and around the county ground, that kind of thing. So which legacies does Somerset get to claim? But also, if they don't claim that legacy of history, who will claim that history? Because, we feel that these stories are really important. So if Somerset County Cricket Club aren't the ones holding up the history, I don't think anyone will. So I guess it's kind of a bit of a trying to make the best of a bad situation, but we still think these stories are really important. I'm going to pass over to Hannah to talk a bit more about those stories a bit more in detail.
Yeah, perfect. And there's also the messiness of the relationship between Somerset Cricket Club, Somerset Board, and all of this that we're kind of exploring and trying to make sense of, as well, as Matt mentioned. So just moving the slide on. So something that I've been trying to focus on a lot more, because as you probably gathered, Matt's experience in terms of archival work and piecing together all of the data and statistics has been absolutely phenomenal. And my research expertise is more the qualitative side, so speaking to people and interviewing athletes in particular. So I just wanted to flag 3 kind of stories that are a little bit quirky and also quite interesting from post 2000s. So the first person that I want to flag up is Magdalena Pokladova. And straight away, you can probably identify the name there. Not sounding like she's from Somerset, because she's from the Czech Republic. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to just turn my office light back on a second. Matt, would you just say a little bit about Magdalena whilst I get my light back on?
Yeah, so Magdalena basically came to Somerset as part of an exchange program to study at Bath University. This is in about 2002, 2003. And she basically knew nothing about cricket, but saw it being played just outside her student hall's window, I think, and basically saw it and wanted to get involved. And kind of a bit of a career stemmed from that, as Hannah can take back over now. She's back in the light.
Perfect. Apologies. Yeah, working at work after hours and the automatic light switch off. But yeah, I think Matt just probably said there about how Magdalena discovered cricket. And we've had email exchanges, doing interviews over emails, sometimes quite difficult because you can't quite get the personality of that person necessarily across within the quotes, but it's really interesting to hear how she first discovered cricket, from completely a non-cricket kind of nation to then discovering it in Bath, to then representing Somerset And she spoke about in her kind of exchange the privileges that she didn't realise she had at that time. So she had kind of like a New Zealand international male coach giving her expertise, which is absolutely kind of like phenomenal. And she developed this love of cricket, which in this quote from a newspaper kind of article, I just think it's a really quirky story in the sense of like England captain at the time, Claire Connor, hit a century, but she's run out by this player from the Czech Republic, that non-cricket nation, that kind of story. It's so quirky, it's so different and so kind of unreported. You know, thinking about international players who've represented Somerset, Magdalena would be one of those people. And thinking of kind of like who gets to represent the county, it's really kind of important to mention people like Magdalena. Moving on to the second person I want to kind of just flag here as well, it's Colleen Ashby. So Colleen Ashby may not be kind of a name that kind of comes to mind, may not be too familiar with people. Matt mentioned in terms of Anya Shrubsole and whether Somerset can claim her history and her success. And in some ways, yes, they can, because she was part of the academy, she played boys cricket and all the rest of it. But before Anya did it, Colleen was the first from what we've kind of found, and from Colleen's kind of words, she was the first female to be on a boys cricket academy, which is a huge achievement, but again, underreported. And there's a lot of kind of hopes on Colleen's shoulders to be that next England player. She's from a very working class background. She was originally from Devon, and she had to take, you know, multiple buses to get to training, all of that kind of narrative and all that kind of sacrifice that we've seen before. But she said, and it was really actually refreshing to hear, because obviously we hear a lot about kind of sexism and misogyny within the game, but she talked so fondly of her time being the only female within that kind of male dominated space. And she said at that time, the Somerset kind of cricket academy felt like a family to her. It brought out the best in her. She developed so much as a cricketer, but then she didn't have the opportunity to translate that back into the women's game. And she also kind of spoke about the difficulty in terms of kind of Somerset wasn't seen at that time as a necessarily kind of a big county in terms of performances, and there was lots of kind of player bias when it came to the England setup from a perception anyways. So it was really difficult to kind of break in. At the same time, kind of there's a lack of psychological support. Thinking about, you know, performance anxiety, fear of failure. She would perform in kind of matches and in training with the boys, but the minute she got an opportunity to step up, she kind of crumbled. And it wasn't that she wasn't talented, it was because she just didn't have that support in place, and it was so rare to get an opportunity. So there's lots of stories that we're uncovering about people who are falling through the cracks of the system, and she is kind of a prime example. And she went off to university, ended up playing in the Oxford Boys Academy. But unfortunately, her first experience is in contrast to the experience with the Somerset boys. So in Somerset, she felt like part of the family. The coaches took her seriously as a cricketer, didn't feel kind of gendered in any kind of particular way. But in Oxford, she turned up to the first kind of meeting with all the other boys. And the first thing the coach said was kind of, "What are you doing here? This is a boys' academy." And she was kind of straight away that kind of feeling of I don't belong, and having to, you know, prove why she was there, and the inappropriate nature of that comment in the first place. She was obviously there because she was talented, but that communication between the two kind of counties wasn't reflected, and she had a more difficult time in Oxford, unfortunately, in terms of acceptance with being within that kind of male dominated space. And in the end, her kind of cricket career as such kind of completely took a backseat in terms of university, in terms of having to work multiple jobs. Cricket took the sacrifice. She did go on to play football to a good standard, but she completely disappeared from the cricket landscape. And my interaction with her not too long ago now, literally probably about August time, I think I spoke to her, was the first time anybody from the game had reached out to her. The first time in over kind of 20 years that somebody had made an interaction and asked her about her cricket story, which I just find is absolutely staggering. Somebody who was such a hopeful to represent England disappears from the game, and not a single person asked why. And there's many players like Colleen Ashby, but the fact that she was the first on that boys' pathway ahead of Anya, I think definitely deserves some element of recognition, breaking into such a male-dominated space. And then the final point for the kind of untold stories within the recent era is Lorraine. I can't speak. Lorraine. I used to play with Lorraine as well. Lorraine Szczepanski. So Lorraine, I grew up with her. So getting her story was so kind of straightforward. But what I didn't realise was having that kind of closeness and familiarity was the struggles and the sacrifices that she's had to make over the last kind of decade after I kind of dropped out of the sport, where she kind of persisted. And she's become the leading kind of wicket taker in T20 and List A cricket for Somerset from the records that we can obviously see and access. But she's kind of a victim in this new structure, thinking about, you know, who gets left behind as the game professionalizes. So the Somerset amateur era is now kind of closed. Lorraine, unfortunately, isn't going to make it into the new kind of Somerset team, didn't get signed or anything. I was basically told you need to go and find a tier 2 team. And that's the end of her Somerset story. And it seems so sad. And Lorraine is another person who had England potential, but faced kind of stereotyping, comments on fitness. And there's kind of an interesting conversation I mentioned in terms of Magdalena's name. Straight away, you think, oh, that may not be a Somerset name. Speaking to kind of Lorraine and her family, there are some kind of questions around, did people have a bias because her surname is Szczepanski? Which kind of took me back at a moment, because I'd never ever kind of considered that a name could hinder your progress within particular pathways. But there is a feeling that there potentially might have been some bias because she was on paper so skilled. She was one of the leading wicket takers in multiple kind of years and things like that. But part of her story also in terms of her England trials was that she was up against Sophie Ecclestone, which at the time, Lorraine did have actually better statistics than Sophie Ecclestone. But obviously, we know that has been a successful choice to choose Ecclestone for the England team, because we've seen how prolific she's been, how far she's gone to be kind of #1 ranked bowler. But again, it's stories like that which people aren't not aware of. And Lorraine's been playing in recent time up until 2024. But not many people know about her or her stories, all the sacrifices that she's had to make to continue to play cricket, to represent the county that she absolutely loves. And now that kind of story is ended, not by her own choice. And there's a lot in terms of the Szczepanski family, in terms of her mum, Cecilia, who's been a scorer for Somerset longer than Lorraine's been playing. So she's kind of volunteered quite a lot of her time within the club. And her dad has taken so many photos that's allowed the game to be recorded in a way that otherwise, if he wasn't taking the photos, who would be? As well as trying to find sponsorship, as well as driving the bus to matches across the country. So there's just kind of 3 examples of stories in the more recent era, and there's many more that we could identify, but the quirkiness, the points of difference, the sacrifice, and as well as the love of the game. And also in the case of Colleen, the fact that she did have a really positive experience within a boys' academy, because we often always just hear that, you know, it is a male domain, there's misogynistic culture, all of this. But for her, it was a completely refreshing take. And she genuinely said that she did not experience any feelings of kind of feeling unwelcome or any comments. She was part of the Somerset family. So what we've done recently as well is we held a reunion as part of our kind of research, because we want to reconnect players back to the kind of the county, back to the region, because quite a lot of the time when we're talking about Somerset, and Somerset have spoken about this a lot, then a club that wants to inspire the Southwest. And again, that idea of the West pops up again. So although we talk about Somerset, we are talking again about kind of a bigger geographical region that links with the county across time. So we held it in January. We had 15 attendees, but it was mainly players who represented the West. Not many players represented Somerset, and the feedback that we had on that was predominantly don't do it on a Wednesday, and ideally do it on a match day instead. So that's really useful feedback for future events, and if anybody else is thinking of holding such moments, then yeah, try and schedule it with a match day instead. Hopefully this will be the first of many, and we need to thank Somerset Cricket Museum and Somerset Cricket Club for putting on the event. They put on kind of pastries, teas, etc. But for some of these people, it's the first time that they thought about cricket in 50 years. which was absolutely kind of staggering to think about. And then kind of realizing the significance of what they did and how they did it, how, we know the stories of sacrifice quite a lot, but, actually what has that meant to allow the game today to take its current form? And I think we do need to recognize that, and we do need to kind of build on that and make sure that these people do not feel forgotten. Because like I said, in terms of my kind of PhD research, that has really stuck with me. The fact that players have felt completely erased from the history of the game. I appreciate kind of women's sport is kind of framed in this kind of new, exciting way, but we can still reflect, the history, and it is an important part, regardless of how new you want to create a new brand. The history is still so important, and also this is a key audience, especially for women's cricket. Sometimes kind of clubs, and I'm speaking generally, I'm not speaking about Somerset at all here, I'm speaking generally. Clubs need to realise that former players are an audience that they could be reaching out to, that they could be driving ticket sales, memberships, or if they're kind enough to give free memberships, even better. But it's definitely an audience that they could be reaching, could reconnect to the game. So what's next? So we've kind of given a glimpse of our kind of research to date. We want to produce a book by Christmas, which might be ambitious, might not be, but we are 3 chapters in, thanks to Matt's brilliant work so far. We need to find a publisher, or if not, we're going to just self-publish because we want to get these stories out there. My kind of role in what Matt and I have been doing is to do more interviews. So trying to get more stories on the record. We're going to keep identifying and try to visit some more relevant archives. We've spoken to kind of lords and things like that, and it's been interesting. Some people have been like, "Oh, we haven't got much on Somerset," and it's like, "But do you, like, you may have, you may not know it yet." So we're going to try and go to different places and find out what we can find. We really would like to work out who those early players are beyond initials, and we've been working with local newspapers as well, like Somerset County Gazette, to try and get that information out there and try to take the traditional media forms, because obviously the people we're targeting are going to be kind of 70s, 80s plus, hopefully still alive. And if they're not, hopefully descendants will be, and there'll be somebody in living memory who can connect us with those names. Definitely write more chapters. We've got 3 finished so far. And we're really keen to get Somerset County Cricket Club on board to host another reunion event on a match day, whether it's at the start or at the end of this new professional kind of competition. We would love to try and bring the past with the present in a very celebratory way, that people do feel recognised, feel proud to be part of the club once again. So just to conclude, the history of women participating in cricket in Somerset is extensive, but remains largely uncharted. Not many people would have known many of the stories that Matt and myself have kind of highlighted here. And these histories are important, they do hold cultural importance, and the narratives of women in cricket needs acknowledgement, especially as we enter this new professional era. Reunion events can play a crucial part in reconnecting individuals to a sport, but we don't want it just to be one-time things. We want it to be consistent, and we do want genuine connections back to the sport. There's nothing worse than a performative gesture. We want something to be a bit more sustainable across the whole of cricket. Acknowledging the game's history allows former players to feel appreciated and recognised, and it evokes feelings and emotions that they haven't necessarily felt. For one player in particular, 50 years. She now has that joy of cricket again. She might come to some of the Somerset women matches in particular. She feels, actually, yeah, what I did was significant. It was an important part of my life, and I'm proud to have played my part, which I think is hugely needed within this space. So the only other thing that I forgot to mention as well is, as we were kind of doing this research as well, we did get a bit of media interest from local BBC within Somerset, across radio and digital, which has been really welcome. So there is a demand, there is an interest in this kind of area, and we would love to see more local histories being done across the UK and across the game. So yeah, that's us. Matt, have you got any final comments?
No, just thanks very much, Hannah. Yeah, really good conclusion. And yeah, we're just looking for any more and any help we can get, and any more stories that we can kind of be pointed towards would be great. But apart from that, we'll keep plowing on and trying to uncover these stories.
Thank you, Hannah and Matt. I'm going to stop the recording there because we don't record the questions. So I'll stop the recording and then